Donna is a clinical social worker in private practice in Highland Park, New Jersey. Donna graduated from the New York University School of Social Work in 2000. In her practice, she has used intersubjective theory. She has over 20 years' experience in various psychiatric and addiction treatment settings. She currently works in an employee assistance program. I'm very excited. We're very excited to hear Donna's presentation. Martin Buber's Relational Turn in World War I. Okay, here you go.
Thanks everyone for being here to listen to my thoughts and ideas.
Can you make it a little louder?
Oh, you can't hear?
We can hear, but very softly.
Okay, hold on. I'm just gonna check my settings because I have a microphone. Is that any better?
Still kind of soft, but we can hear you.
Is this better?
Pretty much the same.
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll just try to speak up more.
Okay, maybe closer, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Okay,
I just wanted to make one announcement. Those that are not sharing, please silence your microphone.
Okay, I hope this works. So I plan to start referencing Martin Buber, as his ideas are familiar to many today with the I thou. And then I'll make the statement that his ideas go through a sort of evolution, which dates back from his growing up in his grandparents' household after his tragic separation from his mother when his parents divorced. At that point, our young 3-year-old Martin was sent to live with his grandparents, and their caretaking environment was not able to emotionally contain his experience of loss from the maternal relationship. This will be seen as Martin Buber's World War I ideas, as well as in his views of women's roles, also commonly held views during Buber's time. And then finally, I'll discuss both Paula Winkler and Gustav Landauer, particularly what occurred in these relationships, which impacted Buber's approach to himself, as well as to emphasize a non-objectifying approach to the other, which his humanistic perspective is known for. Okay, so this is the Martin Buber that, is pretty well known for the I and the thou perspective. The do, which is a familiar and close use of relating to the other in wholeness and an intimate closeness towards other people and or the natural world. So the humanism base from the I thou relationships, the I become through my relationship to the thou, and we need to have intimate relationship to become more human, a more human I within the experience of who I am, versus involvement from a perspective in the world, in which one seeks a type of objectifying experience or more distant experience. These experiences involve objectification of the other, removing their personhood in the process of having an experience. But when one sees the eternal thou and treats the other as we would God, then the experience of a person is not reduced. And one does not look at the other and search for characteristics to identify the other from a far objective perspective, but in relation. Okay, So it's also hard to talk about Martin Buber without talking about, his spiritual Zionism, in which he held, he extended that concept of the I thou and non-objectification towards Palestinians. So he believed in treating them as though not overpowering them or taking over their sovereignty, but in having concern, he had concern for the types of relations that Jews have with Palestinians, and was part of the Brit Shalom movement with Atwood, which his ideas clear there. If you literally look back at his development, his ideas changed in order to develop into the I thou. He was born in 1878 in Vienna, and his parents divorced again, like I said before, when he was 3 years old, at which point he was sent to live with his grandparents in Galicia or Lviv. He lived there until he was 14 years old. So his grandparents were well-to-do and well-established traditional Orthodox Jews, and he was homeschooled in English, French, German, and Jewish subjects until about the age of 10. And he was very sheltered. He wasn't really around other children that entire time. There also was no talk about his separation from his mother, and it seemed that he was not given any description of what was going on or why, or if he would see her again, of which he didn't see her again until about 20 years later. And that's where he had a description of his mismeeting concept from his meeting of seeing his mother again. She had actually run away with a Russian soldier, but it turns out that she was also denied custody or even visitation by a misogynistic legal system at the time. Buber himself expressed having felt that the abandonment experience from his mother impacted him and also was implicit in his ideas. His grandfather, a Talmudic scholar, was absorbed in rabbinic laws and contemplation, while his grandmother did provide some feminine warmth and exposed him to German secular literature. But were it not for an older girl who gave him a response upon him asking her if his mother would ever return at a chance-like occurrence with an older neighbor, she said to him, no, she will not. And he described that as a pivotal point for him as well, of receiving recognition. But aside from that, there really doesn't seem like there was much holding or validation of his trauma and emotional experience, or the impact it had on him. Along with developing a genuine connectedness to his pre-reflective affect in his ideas in order to develop the I thou philosophy, Buber's original way of relating to World War I can be seen in a concept of hypostatization of male and female representations as identified in Nietzschean ideas of the Jewish warrior, as well as the role of the Jewish woman. The purpose of World War I involvement for Germany for Buber was to connect to what he termed what was termed the Orient at the time. Buber, having a view of Viennese modernism as, quote, ultimately amounted to a superficial, even decadent individual, is devoid of heroism, revolutionary self-expression. Buber saw an affirming process in the guidance from Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra of self-mastery and willfulness, freedom from one's authority as was represented in Nietzsche's figure of death, and the concept of willful overcoming. There are resemblances to Nietzsche's themes of fatherly loss, as referred to by Atwood and Arnold in Buber's identification with these concepts. Nietzsche's tragic separation by his father at the age of 4, the loss of a tie in which Nietzsche maintained the fatherly image, and lack of mourning to enable the emotional holding of the loss. Nietzsche represented the experience of a tear in a child's bond by what Arnold and Atwood say is a feeling of rupture of a tear in the fabric of reality and the horror of witnessing a dreadful force wrenching a defenseless child out of the world. Buber's Haftorah at his bar mitzvah include the book of prophets. Quote, the remnant of Jacob, he quoted at the time, the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like droplets on grass, and referred to spiritual youth as sustained by love. In 1900, upon Nietzsche's death, Buber referred to Nietzsche as an emissary of life and a heroic individual, but that Jews, due to the exile from the Spanish Inquisition, bore strongly the illness of the age with the problems of severe nihilism and necessitating a revival. Buber's spiritual Zionism was the answer for this push, either towards life or against life. He otherwise rejected law-based religion, as he felt these rules to be, quote, shackling, as the word he used. However, Buber related to the Jewish holidays and festivals as a willful rejection of rabbinic Judaism connection to childhood spirit and to Zionism. It was a manner to connect to the pre-rabbinical times of the Jewish prophets. This can be seen as a reaction both of Buber not having felt connected to as a child and within his traumatic separation from his mother by the observant environment in his grandparents' household. However, there was perhaps an emotional element in his introduction to German and secular literature, again by his grandmother, which pulled him towards secular studies. Meanwhile, Buber's father's reaction to his parents' household was to veer Buber to a liberal Haskalah-oriented philosophy.
Excuse me, when you I think when you touch the paper to the microphone, it makes terrible sound and it's hard to hear you. So if you could kindly not do it, we would okay. we would appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. It's good to know. I was going to ask if people could hear me. Okay. Buber's original way of relating to World War I can be seen in his hypostatization of male and female representations. Oh, wait, sorry, I went backwards, I think. Oh, his father took him to a Haskalah-oriented synagogue, still influenced by the rationality of the Enlightenment. Buber's father did not appear to recognize the experiences of emptiness and loss on Buber's part, or the experience of emptiness, which the missing discussion from the impact of his mother's loss had on him. Generally, Buber's life encompassed some presence of female connection while lacking that with his father and grandfather. Buber wrote the following statement that It is not those who harbor the same intentions who are transcendently close and related to one another, but those who carry out their intentions, no matter how disparate. In the same way, not those who profess the same beliefs, but those who translate what they believe into deeds. Thus, Buber also saw patriotism as a need of his for masculine identity, as a freeing and perhaps also damming up from the rising up of intense feeling toward action within the individual. It was a raising of the experience above the destruction, death, and tragedies of war. On the contrary, Buber saw German unity within clear belief in and readiness to sacrifice as bringing on that which will mean the fulfillment of life, a seemingly dissociative need for connecting over elemental emotion around masculinity, with a flip side of his self-perception bearing a view of Jewish women based in a narrow constraining purpose and around supporting men's goals and nurturing children. He maintained a view towards Jewish women as responsible for maintaining unity of the household. This could also be seen regarding an expressly negative view of Jewish women and bourgeois who abandon their roles in order to pursue their worldly interests, of leaving home and having perceived them, though they're pursuing other roles as superficial and breaking ties. Therefore, we can view hypostatizations and polarities of the masculine and feminine in Buber's ideas around World War I. Particularly the role of Jewish women seems connected to the underlying feelings that germinated his nationalism around the male ability to be redeemed and the appearance of that masculine-feminine polarity. It's reflecting his self-perception of how he felt about his vulnerable feelings of abandonment in contrast to his view of the other. He may have seen the other as female and the feminine in Paula Winkler as fulfilling the role of the Jewish woman as the mother. Oh, that's more war. He initially called the emotional experience of war a powerful stirring of moribund souls. Buber saw the allegiance to a fatherland. He saw the allegiance to a fatherland and its emotional connections as empowering and as a manner to, quote, free the individual from the bourgeois ethos of self-serving instrumental aims. In this case, it was again his reaction and organizing perceptions around the bourgeois lifestyle as creating a lack of feeling and deadening of the soul, this deadening feeling being a theme of Buber's life and self-experience. It's my understanding that Buber wanted to resolve the unbearable experiences around feeling inhumanely abandoned and unwanted, as well as left powerless and disconnected in his childhood environment. His affinity to willful overcoming and Nietzsche's concepts of das Übermensch were expressed around supporting German nationalism during World War I as a way to revive the male Jewish spirit and reflecting a desire for male connection. This need for male connection by joining in action can be understood in his history of emotional isolation, again, of tragic cutoff from the infantile bond and its aftermath of a remaining childhood environment not meeting the emotional realities around him, therefore resulting in seeing the war as fulfilling that sense of unity, rejecting societal individualism, breaking convention, and the constraints of traditional conventional rationality. Which brings us to Gustav Landauer, who was a revolutionary philosopher 7 years older than Buber. Buber's relationship with Landauer resembled an important tie, as one Buber said that he worried about any sort of estrangement in the relationship, and he believed in mutual aid and communality. Landauer did. Landauer also had an understanding of what he termed calcifying identities, which resemble an understanding of what, in the fashion of intersubjective systems theory, would understand as concretizations. He believed in reflection and conscientious social ties that also support individual freedom. Also, Landauer held a positive belief in being able to relate to all aspects of another. Even though Buber with Landauer removed their involvement in a group including Christians who bore World War I support, Buber maintained in some essays the purpose of Germany for Jews to bridge the Orient and rescue the Oriental spirit. Landauer, calling this the war Buber, confronted Buber within the context of their friendship by explaining their friendship, quote, existed before the war and will outlast it. But told Buber, quote, we can serve our Jewishness by our humanity, and that Jewish work that interferes with our development as human beings cannot be fruitful. He asked him, how are we to live differently, or at least make possible a coherent life for our children? In 1916, Landauer again addressed his equating Germans to Periclean society of culture and democracy. Overall, though, Landauer was able to contextualize his feedback of Buber within what he called a clouding of judgment. Landauer accused support for the war as aesthetizing an ugly reality of aggression and destruction. He criticized Buber's idealization of visualizing what Buber called the heroic Jew, and reflected the reality that many did not join the war out of duty, but out of having no other choice other than worries of being killed, but that manliness, devotion, and courage can be qualities developed outside from war, and that most men want to provide for their families. Subsequent to this, Buber spent 3 days at Landauer's home, after which his thinking turned away from the joining and mysticism connected ideas around war and masculinity. I think the other relationship that's important to changing to Buber's having been able to shift his views and deal with trauma was his relationship with his wife, Paula Winkler. Whilst the early World War I years, Buber seemed to be struggling with self-perception and feelings of loss. Prior to the war years, he did not tell his grandparents of his relationship with Paula Winkler or of their children's births at the turn of the century until his grandfather's death in 1906. Mostly because of his need for their financial support. Paula Winkler, a German Catholic, first converted to Judaism in 1907, again after his grandfather's death, and then he informed his grandmother of their marriage and grandchildren around the same time his children were 7 years old. When the Nazis enacted anti-Jewish legislation, she converted a second time to make a statement of solidarity and to tie her fate to Martin and their family. Paula Winkler gave birth to their 2 children in 1900. Again, her last literary contribution, she was also a writer, she had a literary contribution in her own name and towards Zionism, an article called The Jewish Woman, The Reflections of a Philo-Zionist. Winkler's own view of Jewish men and women were depicted in the article, also stemming from what seemed an idealized view of Jewish men and women that connected her ideas to her mother's stories. Her mother had told her of Jews that she observed. Paula Winkler left her Catholic family behind at the age of 19 and looked towards absorption in Eastern religions at a mystical colony. A discussion of her by the Jewish Museum in Berlin, titled Incredibly Clever, marked Paula as a very strong woman who had a collection of things with personal meanings in them, from handed down articles and meanings around not cutting her granddaughter's hair, very much in a fashion of strong ideas, to the degree that upon her grandchildren's divorce, or her son's divorce, she also kept her grandchildren away from their mother by gaining custody of them through the courts. On the other hand, Paula likely resembled in her strong motherly identity a remothering for Martin, which is resembled in the many letters during the beginning of their relationship and courtship. Martin Buber's misplaced anger at his mother did show up towards Jewish women who may desire for a cosmopolitan lifestyle in his 1901 essay. His 1901 essay depicted the vision of the modern Jewish woman. In Buber's eyes, Jewish women held the main purpose of motherhood. She was also responsible for the unity of the household and the support of men and their goals. Buber felt that Jewish women should return to their roles within the household of shtetl times, for the Jewish home to be, in Buber's words, what it was. For Buber, this was the recovery of something ancient, like also resembling a desire, to reestablish the maternal bond, just as more and more stretches of the once rich, again quoting him, but now decayed soil will be snatched from death and returned to life. So new ideas of the once so productive national soul and ruined for thousands of years will be snatched from death and returned to life. In this, Buber bore tragic reality of his childhood bond that would never be found again, at least not within his own mother, where he said the woman abandoned her children for a life of luxury, and which was a continuing theme that can be seen for him. The purpose of this exploration of Buber's concepts around the land itself, I think, can be seen from Martin Buber's ideas around masculine and femininity, are to see where these themes could also rise in our lives as they are utilized today, in addition to illuminating emotional purposes that they serve. Arnold and Atwood in 2000 again applied the outcome of a psychobiography as having the possibility of enlightening our own emotionally based usage of ideas that we ascribe to, in order to work to develop mastery over what they quote, mastery over the emotional prejudices that may compel us to dogmatically adhere to one theory rather than another. It also does not make a judgment of the person at hand or take an ethical stand on the idea itself, but this would be for the individual to decide for themselves in a manner of taking up the question as to whether the idea or position continues to hold weight for them and their current perspective or understanding. That's my presentation. I'd love to hear people's feedback. Thank you for listening.